today's lecture would in today's lecture we would cover the next type of web services, the resources API or REST concept. And in this concept, starting this lecture, what is the difference between the RPC web services that we analyzed previously and the concept of REST is that when we discussed working with the RPC services, we discussed how to invoke the remote procedure, how we pass the parameters of the remote procedure to the remote system and make this remote system to do something for us. So we talked about the verbs, about the functions, about the procedures. But today, commonly, we need to think about remote services not as remote procedures. Mohammed Hamam, are you here? Because right now I see that you came and you went out. Mohammed, are you here? Please type if you're listening to me. Okay, thank you. So the problem here right now is if we would like to access some resources on the remote service, if we would like not to invoke remote functions, but we would like to manage the resources that are located on the remote server. For example, we want to create our own Facebook and we want to create users there and we want our users to create new posts. We want our users to create new comments, to read the comments of other users, to count the amount of likes and dislikes, and etc. etc. So we see here that the concept is very different from the concept of the remote procedure. In this case, we need some common way to work with remote resources. Especially, we need to read them. We need to manage the information about them. We need to delete these remote resources. So the concept of resource API is that we use standard HTTP protocol methods to work with the remote resources that are identified as URIs. So we create our requests using these methods. We send these requests to the URIs that identify resources that we want to read, to write, or to modify. And the server accepts these requests and sends us the response if the request successfully executed. So on this slide, we can see that the client sends a request, and this request, it does not contain the name of procedure or the parameters of the procedure as we discussed on our previous lectures in the RPC services. In this case, the request have standard HTTP method like get, put, post, or delete. It has URI that identifies the resource that we need to get access to, and possibly the data for the request. For example, if we want to update the existing resource on the remote server, we can put here the representation of this new resource in JSON or XML or plain text or any other format to send to this remote server. So the contents of the message is used to choose the service on the server. The server analyzes the method, the URI, chooses the service and the resource that it should provide, and returns the results of the request processing. These results could have standard or proprietary data types and standard HTTP status code. For example, 200 OK, 404 not found. And this result is going back to the client. This is the overview of the REST concept, and in this lecture we would go to the discussion about how we should implement these type of services on our remote servers. But we should start from the very beginning, from the prehistoric days and the rise of the web, and the two main concepts that are in the heart of the REST are the protocol HTTP and the concept of uniform resource locator. So we should start with Sir Timothy John Berners-Lee. He is the inventor of the World Wide Web, and he created his first web browser, the first web browser in the world, in 1990 in CERN in Switzerland. That was an application that were devoted to solve the problem of data exchange between the scientists who worked in this laboratory on very, very different machines. These machines have very small common things, and the protocols that they use to exchange information, they were very, very different. So Sir Tim Berners-Lee decided that if we want to create a common ground to any machine be able to talk to any other machine, we need to have very, very simple protocol to provide information. So he decided to use text. Especially, he took the existing hypertext idea and wrote his first web browser that connected via the domain name servers and TCP to create the first World Wide Web. His first browser had the name of World Wide Web, and it was also developed in 1990. So here you can see the screenshot how this web browser looked like in the beginning. So to access the remote resources, we use URIs, or Uniform Resource Identifiers. The Uniform Resource Identifier provides the web with a single mechanism for naming resources, and it has very, very simple syntax. Here you can see examples of such Uniform Resource Identifiers. And when we talk about the URIs, we should understand that URL, or Uniform Resource Location, it is a subset of URI that describe a resource in terms of the protocol that is used to access it. URL, it is a special type of identifier that also tells you how to access this resource using standard protocol. For example, HTTP, HTTPS, FTP, or something like this. So the structure of the URL is also provided in this slide. First, in the URL, we provide the scheme, or the basic communication protocol. After, in this part, we provide the authority. The authority have two parts. It is the host of the server where our resource is located, and the port the server is listening to. You remember that the port is defined in the TCP IP protocol stack, and it is a connection that allows input and output information exchange on the server. And after we define the authority, we provide the rest of the URL. It is the path. The path, it is resource resolved by the host. In this part, we also can have some special modifiers, some special query or parameters for this request, but this is the simplest schema of the URL that we can use to access the remote resource. So, and the basics of the foundation of the web and the REST, it is HTTP. The Hypertext Transfer Protocol, or HTTP, is an application protocol for distributed collaborative hypermedia information systems. From the beginning of my lectures, you can remember that the stack of the protocols, it is a set of different protocols that are used to enable communication between open systems. We discussed that there are 7 layers of the OSI model and 4 layers in the TCP/IP protocol stack. There is the basic fabric layer, there is the network layer, there is the application layer on the top of these stacks. So HTTP, it is application protocol that is located on the top of the stack of the protocols. And de facto, HTTP today, it is the main means of exchanging resources in the web. So how does the HTTP protocol exchange looks like? It is very simple. It is a text. It is several rows of text that you send to the remote server to get some resources or to modify some resources. You just send some text to the port that accepts HTTP protocol connection. For example, if we would like to get the content of the page that is located on the following URL, HTTP, the server is bbc.co.uk / the path is weather, we need to send the following request. 1, 2, 3, 4 lines. First line, the method of the HTTP protocol, get. The path of the resource that we want to get, weather. And in the end, the version of the HTTP protocol that we are using, HTTP /1.1. Next, we can specify the user agent who asks for this web page. Here we are using the curl utility to get the information of this page. Next, we specify the host. What is the name of the server that we want to access? And here we specify that the host is www.bbc.co.uk. And the last, accept. What do we accept as the request? Do we accept HTML or we accept JSON or XML? And here we say we would accept everything. Give us anything you can. So when this request is sent to the server would analyze this request, and if it is okay, it would return us the HTTP answer. HTTP 200 OK. That 200 OK means that I got your request and I would send you the response. Next, it would provide you with the header date when the request was processed. What is the name of the server? What is the size of the content that we would receive? What the type of the content that we would receive? It is text / HTML. And then it would give us all the content of the web page, the HTML code of the web page. So get, it is not the only way to organize the communication in the HTTP protocol. It supports several methods. And here I would describe some most commonly used methods of HTTP protocol. There are several more, but I would not go deeper than that. So, first method that we already discussed, get. This method retrieves a resource from a given URI. You send this request if you want to get some information. Delete. Remove a resource from a given URI. If the server gives you authority to modify some resources there, you can send the delete request, and the server then would be able to delete the resource that you wanted. For example, you created some memo on the Facebook and then you want to delete it. The correct way to delete this memo would be to send delete request. Put. The put request updates or alters a resource at the given URI. For example, you have the post, you have some text, and you understand, oh, I want to modify it. Then you can send the put request, and the contents of the element should be modified by the server. Post. It in general implies the creation of new resource in the collection. For example, when you create a new post in the Facebook, you can send the post request and then it would create you a new post. Head. It is a special type of request that gets metadata about the resource. It would return us the same information as the get, but instead of all the information about the resource, including the contents of the web page, for example, it would get us only the head information, only the titles of the HTML response. So we do not get the information about the whole page as well. Options. Options, it is a special request that would return us a list of HTTP methods that are allowed on the given URI. So this is very, very convenient that you can use just text to connect and work with the remote server. If you can use just text to work with the remote server, that means that you can even use some standard text-based tools to access the remote HTTP services. So you know that there is a standard tool that can be installed on any machine that allows the connection to the remote server using the text. It's called Telnet. Telnet, it is a utility that allows you to connect to the remote port, if it is open, and send there some text. So if we have some website that accepts connection on the port 80 HTTP, we can connect to this website using Telnet, and we can send there some requests. So, and if everything is okay, then we would get the content of the web page that we asked for. So let's try to do this. Here I created a web. Here I created the instance of the terminal in my command line window, and I would try to connect to the website phpwiki.ru. I use this website because I tested it and it worked just really, really good. So here you can see that I would try to connect to this connect to phpwiki.ru at the port 80. That means that I would try to use the just a second here. I would try to use the HTTP protocol. So enter. I'm connected. Now I need to send my request. The request is the following: get spacebar / HTTP / 1.1 new line host phpwiki.ru. Enter. Here you see that my request returned me all the information that was on the default web page of this website. It was very, very fast. You saw that it like rained down to me, and you can see that it was not very easy to to read. But here you can see the contents of the web page. And if we would get up about this request, we would see that this website sent us the response HTTP 1.1 200. Okay, that means that we're established connection with this website using the HTTP protocol. And this website sent us the result. The connection was closed and the server closed the connection, but you can see that very simple text requests can handle this HTTP protocol, is in the basics of this HTTP protocol. So REST and the REST is abbreviation for the representational state transfer. And this concept or architectural style defines the process of working with resources on the internet through the standard HTTP queries. And it was introduced in the 2000 by Roy Fielding in his doctoral thesis. So you can see that not all doctoral theses are useless. Some of them are very, very useful, and they form the development of whole World Wide Web in several decades. So Roy Fielding is also known as one of the founders of the Apache HTTP server project and the head of Apache Software Foundation. So he is very, very famous in the world of web servers. So REST, it is a concept that supports many services that would like to use standard ways to implement standard create, read, update, and delete operations on the remote resources. If we would use the standard remote procedure call approach, then on each of the resource that we want to create, we need to create a new special API. For example, we want to work with the users on our remote server. And what do we want to create to work? What do you want to do with the users? We want to create the user. Create user. We want modify user. Modify user. We want delete user. Delete user. And we want to get information about the user. Get user. So only one entity type, users, would lead us to creation of 4 separate procedures in our API. That means that our API would be at least 4 times bigger than the amount of the resources that we want to work with. Each one resource would lead us to creation of 4 specific procedures. That is insane. That is not how it should work. So REST provides the ability to manipulate remote procedures, remote resources, but avoid direct dependence on remote procedures and minimize the need of object-oriented APIs because it uses the standard methods of HTTP protocol to work with these remote resources. If we compare these requests, the REST with the SOAP that we discussed on our previous lecture, SOAP client creates XML messages using the SOAP protocol and send them to the remote server on one URL, server/SOAP/router, for example, and using only one, maybe two HTTP methods, post and get. But that doesn't do anything because SOAP do not use the HTTP methods to identify the procedure. SOAP uses only information inside the message to identify the procedure. So the web server would get this XML document, it would analyze this, and it would call the server object, modify it or read it, and would send the information about this object back to the user. Comparing to the SOAP, REST works very differently. So HTTP is used as the foundation of the REST. And if we would like to read some information about some object on the remote server, we need to pass the HTTP method get directly to the URL that identify the object that we want to work with. If we want to modify this object, we would need to get another method, not get, but we need to use put here. And when we put here and we pass the information about the object that we want to put, the server would understand that instead of reading, we want to write the information to the remote object. So here we compare the REST and the SOAP. REST, it is architectural style. It is not a protocol. It is just a way to use the HTTP. And SOAP, it is a family of protocols. SOAP Web Services, it is a family of protocols as we discussed on our previous lecture. It uses XML, WSDL, SOAP, UDDI to organize the work with the remote services. So REST can use anything as a basic media for representation of data. It can use XML, it can use JSON, it can use HTML, JPEG, MP3. Anything would be a resource in the REST concept. SOAP Web Services, if you want to pass something, you need to cover it inside the XML. If it is not inside XML, it is not SOAP Web Service. HTTP is the backbone of everything in REST. In SOAP, HTTP is only one kind of the transport. You can use SMTP, you can use FTP, anything you can use to pass the XML requests. REST, everything is the resource. SOAP, everything is a function. So here you would work with resources, with nouns. And in SOAP concept, you work with functions, with verbs. So REST, everything is a resource. A resource can be a text file, media file, some video, audio, a row in the database table, a set of related data, for example, products, a logical transaction, a queue, a program, a business process. Everything can be resource. If you can create a URL that would identify this resource, then you can create this resource. Here we can see that we would like to go to this website and we would like to read some information about the users, and the identifier of this user is Ivan99. So this user right now is a resource for us. On the same website, we can see that we can go and check about some albums. And we would like to check about the album number 8. So album here is also a resource. Resource collection is also a resource. So if we have access to the list of the users of the website, we can get them and we can modify them. For example, if we are administrator of this website. So the basics of the REST, very, very similar to the basics of the XML web services. First, we would like to make our REST services stateless as possible. As you remember, we define in this course the stateless service is the service when all the information the server needs to process the request is contained inside the request. If it is true, then the service would be stateless. And the second thing, it is client-server separation or loose coupling. Our REST services should provide widely available API, but they should provide no information about how this API is implemented inside. So if we develop a good REST API, that means that this API should provide no information about how it is implemented inside it. Do we use PHP? Do we use Java? Do we use folders to stack the photos, or we use some SQL server to store the information? That should not bother our users. It should not be clear in the API that we use some specific method to work with the data on the server. So when we send the request to the server and the server processes this request, with the response, the server should return standard HTTP response. There is a set of standard HTTP responses that are available for us, and they're very useful to make the client understand what happened on the server side. If we send some GET request, as you saw in the demo that I showed you when I sent the GET request to the server, and the server processed this request, and it sent me back the content of the web page I requested. In the beginning, it would send me the response 200 OK. So for example, let's imagine that we are going to the wardrobe and we have some tag as the identifier of the clothes that we want to get. So we give the tag to the wardrobe employee, and he or she goes inside the wardrobe and searching for our clothes on the hangers. So if we give them the tag and the tag is okay, it is valid, then the wardrobe employee would go and return us the clothes. So here it would be 200 created. 200, okay. Second, we are giving them the clothes, and then they accept it. They would return us the response 201 created. Please do not lose the tag that we would give you, because using this tag then you can access the object that you gave us. 204, no data, would be returned if you issued the delete method. That means that everything was okay, we deleted this, and right now there is no data in this response. If there is some error in the request processing, there are some standard ways to make user understand that there was some error in the processing of the request. If the error is on the client side, there would be 400 and something responses. For example, response 400 means bad request. If I would try to connect to the same server, but I would have some typo in the HTTP request, it would return me the answer 400 bad request. I don't understand what you are talking about. 403, forbidden. That response is given to me if I would try to get some access to a restricted area where I have no credentials to access to. On the next lecture, we would discuss the basic of authorization in the REST, and here you would get these responses if you are unauthorized to modify or to read the contents of the object on the remote server. 415, unsupported media type. When you send the request, you can specify the media type that you want to get or you want to put. For example, when you send information about some object, you can specify that you send it in JSON format or XML or plain text. And when the server receives your request and he can read it, then there is okay, we can create new object. But if it cannot process the format that you proposed, then it will return you the error 415. If there are some problems on the server side, you would be returned with the responses 500 something. So when you try to connect to some server and there are some big issues and the server doesn't work, it would return you the server error 500. We are not working. And if you try to access some method that was not implemented on the server yet, it can return you the response 501, not implemented. So now we discussed the process of accessing the remote resources and types of responses that the server can give us. Now let's go and discuss the naming types of the resources. So resource names should be nouns and not verbs. If you see a verb in the name, that is most likely a design error of the REST interface. So you should not have names like get all dogs or get dog or new dog or save dog. For example, when you work with some dog browsing website, you should not have some names like create user or new user create. Instead of verbs, when you define resource, you should use nouns. And there should not be verbs in the resource name because you need to use standard HTTP methods that would be identified as verbs. Should not do this. So when you work with the remote API, when you design remote API, there are some best practices or working with the HTTP requests, and in this part of the lecture we would discuss these best practices. First, the naming practice. The best way to sort or to create resources on the website would be to create them the following way. First part, of course, it is the website where you host your resources. HTTPS, it is a protocol to access these resources. You can see here that it is necessary to use HTTPS because HTTP right now is open and widely used to manipulate data, and some bad providers even inject their advertisements in the HTTP protocols. So you should not do this. You should not use HTTP as the basis of the communication protocol. You should use HTTPS everywhere when it is possible. After you defined your protocol and the website, when you're going, or you can put port here, in the path you should define the entity that you are working with, identifier of the entity, and maybe some parameters to the request. Entity, it is a class or table view of the database, for example, users. or dictionary. Should be some entity here. Identifier, it is the primary key of the object that you're working with. If the primary key is composite, the parts are indicated through the slash. For example, if we want to take some user number 10, we should put slash users slash 10. If we would like to get some element of our dictionary from our English part, then we should put dictionary English app title. Or we can also put some parameters here to get some filtering if we get a list of the entities that we want to work with. So to work with the remote resources, we can use the following 4 main methods of the HTTP. Get some entity ID is used to get a resource. Put entity ID is used to create or update a resource. Delete entity ID, remove resource. Post entity, create a resource in the collection. Let's go one by one about how these methods should be implemented. First, get single entity. Get entity ID. It is used to get some resource. Resources can be stored in our database. They can be located in our file storages. Any way you store the resource, if you receive this request, the server should return the resource that was requested by the client. If successful, the server returns 200 OK and all the object fields that are available to this user in such formats as JSON or XML in the response body. If there is no object with this ID, the server should return 404 not found. And some additional features, the server always should necessarily include headers regarding the caching policy. Because if the server would not define the caching policy, then this request would be cached in the web browser. And if user several times would request the same resource, the web browser instead of going to the remote site would use the cached version, even if the resource on the website was updated. Next, we can request for the whole list of the objects implementing method get entity without specific identifier. We can provide here some filtering parameters as the parameters of the request, and this method is used to obtain a list of objects with the corresponding filtering fields. If this method is successful, the server should return to the user 200 OK answer with array of objects, for example like JSON objects, in the response body. Also with this object, the server can return URLs to each of the object in the collection. Method put changes the whole object. When the client invokes the put method to the remote server, the client should put all the fields of the alterable object in the request. It can be JSON representation, XML representation, any other representation. It should be included in the put method. If the implementation of this method is acceptable by the remote server, the server would pass the 204 no data request, because there would be empty body of the request because the client has all the necessary data about what object it updated and what is the current state of the object. Post method. It creates a new entity. Comparing to the put object, it is almost the same, but the post method would automatically create new object every time you call this method. In the put method, you change the entity that is already there, and if you repeat this method with the same body, then the database would not be changed, because if you several times make this request, you just several times update the same object with the same parameters. But when you invoke the post method with the same parameters in the same entity, the server would create a new object for every time when you submit the post request. The successful implementation of the post method would return 201 created response with the empty body, but with additional header indicating the location of the created object. For example, here we can see location, entity, new ID. And one more time, if the client implements the post method call several times with the same parameters, then the server would create several identical objects in the class entity. Delete. Delete method removes the object if it exists. If successful, he returns 204, no data. We deleted it, there is no data, with an empty body. Head. As I told you, head, it is headline request. It should be implemented by the server because a lot of web browsers use this request as a pre-flight query before performing potentially dangerous, in their opinion, operations. For example, when the web browser requests some very big file, he can send the head request, get back the amount of the file, and then the second time implement the get request. So let's take a look on the examples of how the REST URL and methods invoking works. We have some server on the URL example.com. We have a set of resources, and we have one item that we want to work with. If we invoke the get request with this path, resources / item 17, the server would get the item status. It would send us the contents of this object. If we would invoke the put method on this object, resources / item 17, and we would provide the necessary information about how to change this, about the new state of this item 17, then this request would replace this element with another element. If such element doesn't exist, then this element would be created. Post. It normally does not used to create an object if this object is already created. It is used to create an object inside the list of different objects. Delete, then it would be deleted. This item would be deleted. If we use the same methods to the collection of the resources, get would give us a list of different resources available on the server. Put, if we provide new collection, then the put would replace this collection with another collection. post to this collection would create a new item in the collection. Delete would delete the collection. So here we can see some standard REST actions. For example, post albums, create new album, get albums to, get the album number to, put albums to, update the album number to, delete albums to, delete the album number to in the remote website. Wrong REST interface. We can see here we use the post method, and then in the URL we use the create verb. That is not correct. You should not use verbs in the URLs to implement some actions. You should use the methods of the HTTP protocol. Get albums show to, the same thing. The problem is that you already have the method get. You should not use the verb in the URL. Post update to. There are some problems here. There are two problems here. First problem. In the URL you have some verbs, and these verbs are not corresponding with the method that is used here. The worst part here, it is this. Get delete albums to. You should never do this, because the get request, it is the default request that is invoked by the web browser when you click on the web link. So there was a big scandal with the Gmail when they wanted their users to get some additional features when they search for the mail. So it was in the beginning of 2000s. Gmail was not so big, and they decided, okay, we would search for the contents in the mail that our users would receive. So the user receives some mail, and the Gmail would put their crawlers to read the contents of the mail and to click on every link and to go to the every link that is inside this email. First of all, of course, there are some privacy concerns. When you send someone your email, you don't think that someone else besides the user that would read this email would click on the links inside this email. But the problem was worse, because there were some forums. And when the user create a new post in the forum would send him an email that your post was successfully created. And if you would like to read this post, you should go to this link. If you want to update this post, you should go to this link. If you want to delete this post, you should go to this link. And these links were automatically created, and they did not need the acknowledgement from the user. The user just presses on this button and the message is deleted. So the user receives this email, the crawler goes to this email and he starts to click on the links. Okay, first I read this message. Good. the contents of this message goes to the crawler. Wonderful. Next, he clicks on the update and he receives the update window from the forum, but he do not want to update anything, so that is no problem at all. That is good. That is okay. And that is okay. Next, he clicks on the link to delete the message. So can you please write me in the chat what would be with the message in the forum if the web crawler clicks on the delete link in the forum? So this web crawler would invoke the get request to the URL that was provided here, and inside this URL the action would be delete. When the forum sees this request, it understands that the user clicked on the delete button and it deletes the message whatsoever. So a lot of users who had some posts on the forums and who received such emails, their messages were just deleted from the forums because of the work of these web crawlers that invoked every link on the message using the get method. So, if you need to remember only one thing from my lecture today, you should remember this. You should never use the get method on your website to modify or delete your resources. You should use get methods only to get information from the website, not to modify, not to update, not to delete, just to get the information from your web service. So now, the conclusion. The REST style today is the most popular method of organizing open web services that provide work with the state of the remote resources. Standard HTTP protocol methods are used to support work with the state. And when you work with the remote resources, you commonly would use get method to get the information about the remote resource, put method to update the information on the remote resource, delete method to delete the entity, and post method to create new entity in the collection. The rest is based on the HTTP protocol and it used the standard HTTP methods, requests and responses to organize the work with the remote objects, with the remote resources for the user.